Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen, for the wider Catholic public, particularly in Europe, North America, and in Latin America, Professor Roberto de Mattei needs no introduction. He has been involved in the Catholic apostolate, particularly the counter-revolutionary Catholic apostolate, for over 40 years. He was born in Italy on the 21st of February 1948 in Rome, and he is a historian by profession. His studies mainly concern European history between the 16th and 20th centuries, but he has focused especially on the history of religious and political ideas. He is known for his criticisms of relativism, Marxism, and the neo-modernism that sadly has infiltrated Catholic circles over the past 60 years or so. Professor de Mattei has extensively studied European history of the 16th and 20th centuries, with this focus on the history of religion. Among other academic positions, he was Professor of Modern History at the Faculty of Arts of the University of Cassino, and more recently was also Professor of Modern History and the History of Christianity, and the coordinator of the degree course in Historical Sciences at the new European University of Rome, founded in 2004. Between 2003 and 2011, Professor de Mattei was Vice President of the National Research Council of Italy. He is a member of the Board of Directors of the Italian Historical Institute for the Modern and Contemporary Age, and a member of the board of the John Paul II Academy for Human Life and the Family, as well as of the Italian Geographic Society. He is the president of the Fondazione Lepanto, based in Rome, but also which has offices in Washington, D.C., and is editor-in-chief of the monthly review Radici Cristiani, and the quarterly historical review Nova Historica. He also directs the Corrispondenza Romana news agency. Between February 2002 and May 2006, he held the post as advisor for international affairs to the Italian government. He has cooperated with the Pontifical Council for Historical Sciences and was awarded and raised to the order of the knighthood of St. Gregory the Great as an acknowledgement of his service to the Roman Catholic Church. One of Professor de Mattei's several books is to be found at the very entrance of this hall on that display table at the bottom over there. It's called The Church in the Current Tempest. And I encourage those who are concerned with the present crisis of the faith that we are living in to purchase a copy. The book is written in English. The subject of Professor de Mattei's address is very, very timely, particularly in the age we're living in, and particularly in view of recent developments in the European Parliament. The identity of Europe, is it Christian roots, or have we now become a dictatorship of relativism? And without further ado, I would ask Professor Roberto de Mattei to give his presentation.
Thank you very much. I accepted Philip Beatty's invitation Professor Philip Beatty's invitation with a great pleasure, not least because in addition to directing a magazine called Christian Roots since 2005, from 2002 to 2006, as an advisor to the Italian government, I followed with participation the debate on the inclusion of Christian rules in the European Constitutional Treaty. So my presentation will develop 3 points. One, the Christian roots of Europe as a factor of its identity. Second, the dictatorship of relativism. And third, the future of Europe in the present hour. So, Europe's Christian roots as a factor in its identity. There are those who claim that the Christian roots of Europe are a myth. An Italian historian, for example, Santelesti, has published recently a book with the title and with this title and subtitle, "The Myth of Europe's Christian Roots from the French Revolution to the Present Day." this subtitle is revealing, because for the author of this study, the idea of Europe's Christian roots or identity is an ideological representation of the last 2 centuries. But why does this idea develop especially since the French Revolution? The answer is clear, because until that date, the Christian identity of Europe was an objective reality which no one questioned. For example, the States General that preceded the French Revolution in May 1789 opened with a procession of the Blessed Sacrament, because God was still present in every aspect of society, despite the demolishing work of the Enlightenment. The famous essay by Friedrich Novalis, titled Christianity or Europe, was composed between October and November 1799 in the aftermath of the French Revolution, after a storm of anti-Christianity had swept across Europe. The French Revolution marks the symbolic transition from the age of Christianity to the age of modernity, and it is logical that in the Enlightenment and the historicist view of history, the Christian identity of history appears as a myth, while the nascent Catholic Romanticism evokes, with the words of Novalis, the beautiful times full of splendor when Europe was a Christian country, when a single Christianity dwelt in this part of the world shaped in a human way. A single great common interest united the farthest provinces of this vast spiritual realm. Among the historians who demonstrated the Christian genesis of Europe in the 20th century were the Swiss Gonzague de Reynaud and the British Christopher Dawson, both of whom participated with many others in the conference that the Royal Academy of Italy held in 1932 in Rome on the subject of Europe, and in an international conference with the most distinguished scholars of the time, none of whom questioned the Christian identity of Europe. But here we are not interested in the historiographical course of the notion of Europe's Christian roots. We want to start from the teaching of the popes, especially John Paul II and Benedict XVI, in the face of contemporary Europe's loss of identity. Christian roots have been the main thread of John Paul II's magisterium on Europe, encapsulated in his exhortation Ecclesia Dei, resumed in his exhortation Ecclesia in Europe of the 28th of June 2003. But as far back as 1982, in his address to the presidents of the bishops' conferences of Europe in Santiago de Compostela, John Paul II made this appeal to Europe: open the doors to Christ, be yourself, rediscover your origins, relive your roots. The Pope was therefore addressing a Europe that had lost or was about to lose its Christian identity, and he invited it with vibrant words to rediscover itself, to return to its roots, which were and are Christian. And when we speak of Europe, we must not confuse two different concepts. Historical Europe, which has its centuries-old roots in the Christian Middle Ages, and institutional Europe, which was born as an economic community with the 1957 treaties of Rome and after the Maastricht Treaty of 1992 became a political union. And it is precisely with the abandonment of Europe's Christian roots by its political leaders that John Paul II defines his thinking. In the process of European construction, a new phase opened up after the Maastricht Treaty, inaugurated by the Nice European Council in December 2000. This phase was characterized by the attempt to move from economic Europe to political Europe through the instrument of a constitutional charter. The Conference of European Heads of State and Government in Nice produced a document, the Charter of Fundamental Human Rights, which in 2000 did not have binding legal force, but is now an integral and legally binding part of the Lisbon Treaty, which entered into force in 2009. A few days after the signing of this document, on December the 16th, 2000, on the occasion of a congress taking place in the Vatican to celebrate the 1200th anniversary of the coronation of Charlemagne, John Paul II, in a message to the Congress participants, contrasted the Europe outlined by the Nice Charter of Rights with the work of the great Emperor, father with Saint Benedict of Christian Europe. Thanks to Charlemagne, said the Pope in his message, Europe, which was not a geographically defined unity, only by accepting the Christian faith did it become a continent. Down the ages, this continent succeeded in spreading its values to almost every other part of the world for the good of humanity. At the same time, we must not forget that the ideologies which unleashed rivers of blood and tears during the 20th century came from a Europe that had wanted to forget its Christian roots. And John Paul II expressed his disappointment at this point with these words: that in the Charter's text there is not a single reference to God, yet in God lies the supreme source of the human person's dignity and his fundamental rights. It cannot be forgotten that it was the denial of God and his commandments which led in the last century to the tyranny of idols. A race, a class, the state, the nation, and the party were glorified instead of the true and living God. In the light of the misfortunes that overtook the 20th century, we can understand the rights of God and man stand or fall together. End of quotation. The Nice Conference entrusted a European Convention with the task of drafting a constitution for the new 27-member Europe, a conference which was taking shape with the accession of the Eastern European countries to the Union. The convention, chaired by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, met in Brussels from March 2002 to June 2003, and at the end of its work sent the European heads of state and government a draft constitutional treaty which was ratified in Rome on the October 29th, the 29th of October 2004. The draft of this treaty lacked any reference to the Christian identity of Europe. In his apostolic exhortation Ecclesia in Europa, John Paul II renewed his request to those responsible for the future constitutional treaty. So, he wrote, so that it will include a reference to the religious and in particular the Christian heritage of Europe. In an era that appears to be a time of bewilderment of the Christian memory and heritage, the pontiff affirmed, the Church today feels the responsibility and urgency of not squandering this precious patrimony and of helping Europe to build itself by revitalizing its original Christian roots. But his words, unfortunately, fell on deaf ears. John Paul II died the 2nd of April 2005, but the call to Europe's Christian roots was also a cornerstone of the pontificate of Benedict XVI, who had already set out his thoughts as Cardinal Ratzinger in the book, in dialogue with Marcello Pera, entitled Without Roots, Europe, Relativism, Christianity, Islam. Islam was the new political subject appearing on the horizon after the attack on the Twin Towers on 11th September. And a return to the Christian roots of the Europe and the West was for Benedict XVI the antidote to secularism, but also to radical Islam. At his first general audience on April the 27th, 2005, the new Pope said he had chosen the name Benedict for himself in honor of Benedict XV, but also to evoke the extraordinary figure of the great patriarch of Western monasticism, Saint Benedict of Norcia, who is a fundamental reference point for European unity and a powerful reminder of the indispensable Christian roots of his culture and civilization. A month later, on June the 16th, receiving the new ambassador of the Republic of Malta, he said, "I feel close to the Maltese people. Down the centuries, they have always shown their special, deep attachment to the successor of Peter, Bishop of Rome and pastor of the Universal Church. I am well acquainted," said Benedict, "with the fidelity to the gospel and to the church, Mr. Ambassador, which are features of the Christians in the country that you represent. Consistent with their Christian roots, they feel the importance of their mission also in this delicate phase of European and world history. The Maltese people know that it is an integral part of the large expanse known as Europe. Moreover, in keeping with the noble spiritual and cultural traditions that have marked it down the centuries, it wishes to do its utmost to prevent the European community in the third millennium from losing the patrimony of cultural and religious values of its past. Indeed, it is only on this condition that it will be possible to build a future of solidarity and peace with firm hope. End of quotation. The constitutional treaty approved in Rome in October 2004 had to be approved by the national parliaments of the European states in order to enter into force. And after a difficult journey, the milestone was reached on December the 3rd, 2009 with the Lisbon Treaty. In the Nice Charter of Rights annexed to the Lisbon Treaty, there is not only the absence of any reference to Europe's Christian roots. The heart of this document is Article 21, which, in the name of the so-called principle of non-discrimination, has opened the door to the introduction of legal aberrations such as the crimes of homophobia and Islamophobia, or the legalization of homosexual marriage. Moreover, the refusal to include a reference to Christianity in the constitutional treaty was not, as some thought, a rejection of a confessional vision of society, but a claim to erase all memory of Christian influence in European history. In order to attribute an authentically Christian character to the document, it would have been necessary to record the natural and divine order on which human society must be founded. Pius XII, in a speech made in 1948 to the participants at the International Congress to establish the European Federal Union, stated that a generic mention of Europe's Christian heritage would be insufficient in the construction of Europe if it was not accompanied by a reference to the divine and natural law that constitutes the unshakable moral basis of society. The Pope said he took a great pleasure in the mention of the common heritage of Christian civilization by the Congress. However, this is still not enough until there is an express recognition of the rights of God and His law, at least of natural rights, the solid foundation on which human rights are anchored, separated from religion. How will these rights and any freedom be able to ensure unity, order and peace? These were the words of Pius XII. But for the architects of the Nice Charter, it was not only the natural and Christian order, but any historical memory of it that had to be erased. The deletion of the reference to Christian identity in the Lisbon Treaty thus had a much stronger significance than its inclusion in the constitutional text, the inclusion of Christian roots would have had. If in fact the reference to Christian roots would not have made the treaty Catholic or Christian, the removal of this reference gave the document a decidedly secularist or anti-Christian tone. The American scholar Joseph Weiler has well observed this in a book written in Italian, Europa Cristiana, un saggio esplorativo. He wrote that the symbolic and social resonance of rejection is far more significant than actual acceptance by the convention would have been. And the Lisbon Treaty does not only reject the legal relevance of Christianity, but the very historical relevance of the Christian phenomenon. Christianity must be removed from historical memory and public space to avoid any form of Christian self-understanding of Europe. Against this secularist perspective, the teaching of John Paul II and Benedict XVI can be summarized in these terms. The soul of Europe is the heritage of values that has permeated its institutions and customs and allowed its civilization to perpetuate itself over time and spread across space. A heritage of values that, as John Paul II wrote in his book Memory and Identity, are derived from the Gospel and have developed in coherence with it. Let us pray, said Benedict XVI at Monte Cassino on May the 25th, 2009, that Europe will always know how to value this heritage of Christian principles and ideals, which constitutes an immense cultural and spiritual wealth. Since Benedict XVI's resignation from the papacy, the debate on Christian roots has not only lost relevance, but has extended from the European to the world level. It has become the debate on the cultural roots of that great Europe we call the West. In recent years, in fact, the process of secularization of Europe and more generally of Western civilization has become radicalized, taking on forms of strong anti-Christianity. The expression dictatorship of relativism, used by Benedict XVI in the Missa pro Eligendo Pontifice of April the 18th, 2005, a few days before his election, this expression effectively defines the cultural horizon of contemporary society. Relativism is an ancient doctrine dating back to the 5th century before Christ, when Protagoras first expressed the formula that man is the measure of all things. Relativism was refuted by Plato and Aristotle, but it was Christianity that gave the definitive answer to this doctrine. Plato and Aristotle indeed demonstrated the inconsistency of relativism and man's need for the idea of truth, but only Christianity affirmed itself in terms of truth, exclusive and integral. Only Jesus Christ said of himself, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Only the Catholic Church claims to be the custodian of the unique truth of supernatural salvation for mankind. This is why the Catholic Church is the target of all relativism. The first 3 centuries of Christianity's life were the clash between Christian truth and the relativism of the Roman Empire, which housed all cults in the pantheon, but denied citizenship to Christianity because of its refusal to incense the gods. The persecution of Christians was the first fierce dictatorship of relativism in history, from which Christianity emerged victorious, creating on the blood of martyrs the Christian civilization of which Europe is the daughter. Since the French Revolution, society, moving away from its Christian roots, has plunged into a more intolerant relativism than the ancient one. This relativism has different levels of expression. The relativism of knowledge, or gnoseological relativism, affirms that a human mind cannot know reality in itself, but only as it appears to the subject that knows it. Metaphysical relativism affirms that there are no immutable truths in time and history. Religious relativism proclaims the equivalence of religions. Cultural relativism equates civilizations and cultures. Moral relativism denies that there are objective goods to which man as man tends by his will. But relativism, before being an ideology, today is a spirit and a mentality. It is a lived relativism expressed by fashions and politically correct language. According to this relativism, any human experience has its justification. There are no ideas or behavior that are wrong in themselves, because there are no truths or goods of a universal and absolute order. Relativism starts from different premises than materialism, but arrives at the same consequences. In the materialist perspective, if God does not exist, if the soul is not immortal, if the only horizon of human life is one's own corporeity, what other value could exist outside the needs and aspirations of one's own body? And in the relativist perspective, if there are no absolute and universal values, because everything changes in an ever-changing reality, for what values outside of one's own contingent interests should man live and die? The alternative is between those who believe that nothing absolute exists, because everything is relative to places, times and circumstances, and those who believe in the existence of non-negotiable values based on a natural law, valid at all times and in all places, because it is inscribed in the very heart of man, this natural law, in the heart not of this or that individual man, but of man as such, in human nature considered in itself, in its permanence. If we lose the sense of an objective law and replace the word law, which as such imposes duties, with the word rights, with no other reference outside man, we take a path that makes us lose the existence of any principle of a universal character. This is why the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights which constitute the source of legitimization of international institutions such as the UN throughout the post-war period in the 20th century, has given way to a catalogue of new rights, which are not natural rights because they are not based on the existence of human nature. On the contrary, they deny the existence of an objective human nature. And what are these new rights or pseudo-rights? We know them: the right to abortion, the right to contraception, the right to compulsory sex education, the right to same-sex marriage, the right to surrogacy, the right to euthanasia and assisted suicide, the right to sex change. These rights cannot be considered as such because they are not universal and absolute, and they are not so because they are not based on an objective order of values founded on human nature. With the fall of natural law, the very idea of a freedom falls, replaced by that of force. Because if there are rights and duties rooted in human nature, it is evident that this natural law constitutes a protective barrier against arbitrariness and against the prevarication of the strongest. But if this law does not exist, what other law can replace that of force? John Paul II emphasized several times in the encyclical Veritatis Splendor and reiterated it in Evangelium Vitae that relativism has as its only principle that of force, because to the extent that it dissolves truth, with truth falls the only barrier that can oppose the will to dominion of the strongest. It may be the force of numbers, the force of the voting booth, or the force of a despotic regime, but it is always force. The value of democracy, says John Paul II, stands or falls with the values it embodies. I quote him, the basis of these values cannot be provisional and changeable majority opinions, but only the acknowledgement of an objective moral law which, as the natural law written in the human heart, is the obligatory point of reference for civil law itself, Evangelium Vitae. Freedom negates and destroys itself and becomes a factor leading to the destruction of others when it no longer recognizes and respects its essential link with the truth. In this way, democracy, contradicting its own principles, effectively moves towards a form of totalitarianism. It is always Evangelium Vitae. Well, we know that there is no more absolute sovereign than the Pope, but not even the Pope can change natural and divine law. His power, the power of the Pope, has an insurmountable limit constituted by this law. Whoever oversteps this limit transfers absolute sovereign power to the legislator or mere individual. The will of majority becomes the supreme source of the morality. What is lawful today may be unlawful tomorrow, and vice versa, depending on the different majorities that compose or recompose themselves. But the majority, wrote the then Cardinal Ratzinger, cannot be the ultimate principle. There are values that no majority has the right to abrogate. And if man can decide alone, without God, what is good and what is bad, John Paul II wrote in Memory and Identity, he can also decide that a group of men should be annihilated. It is in this perspective that the constitutionalization of abortion approved in France on March the 8th, 2024, some days ago, is to be seen. This act, which French President Macron called a universal message, constitutes a legal response to the US Supreme Court's ruling of June 2020 that overturned Roe v. Wade, denying abortion constitutional dignity. The two legal rulings, the American and the French, have enormous symbolic significance. The United States tells us that abortion is not irreversible. France proclaims that it is a road of no return. And the battle is ongoing. On 2 days ago, the European Parliament voted a resolution in favor of including abortion in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. But if abortion is a constitutional right protected by law, then any criticism of this right, any form of conscientious objection to the law on abortion can be defined as unconstitutional and therefore punishable by law, similar to the crime of homophobia, for which a priest of the Good Shepherd Institute some days ago was denounced by the French government, accused of having recalled in a video that, according to Catholic doctrine, homosexuality is a sin. This is the dictatorship of relativism of which Benedict XVI speaks. Dictatorship of relativism because interdiction and censorship weigh on all absolute principles, on all religious and moral truths that have characterized our history, our tradition before and after Christianity. The outcome of this dictatorship is the disintegration of society, the permanent chaos. If man is evolving matter, if history evolves, if everything transforms and mutates, then the vortex of relativist dissolution opens up, which today has its final step in the theory of gender, according to which even biological identity, male and female, is not can be modified at will. Nothing is in itself, everything can be self-determined. In the Declaration Dignitas Infinita of the Dicastery of the Doctrine for the Faith approved by Pope Francis on April the 8th, we read, desiring a personal self-determination, as gender theory prescribes, apart from this fundamental truth that human life is a gift, amounts to a concession to the age-old temptation to make oneself God, entering into competition with the true God of love revealed to us in the Gospel. Benedict XVI renounced to the papacy in 2013, but before he died, he was able to witness the development of the so-called cancel culture and the woke ideology, which represent the most radical expression of contemporary relativism. The woke ideology is the application of gender theory to the history of peoples. Every trace of historical identity must be erased. For woke culture, the figures that must be erased from historical memory are Christopher Columbus, the conquistadores, and even people like Winston Churchill, who is accused of racism and colonialism, but above all is guilty of embodying the pride and the warrior spirit of the West. The West is to be stripped of its history and identity to genuflect before peoples with opposing values. The end point of the dissolution of Christian roots is a nihilistic relativism that assumes self-dissolution as its program and that finds in this suicide its own revolutionary coherence. Cardinal Ratzinger expressed it in these terms: "There is here a self-hatred of the West which is strange and which can only be regarded as something pathological. The West tries, yes, in a laudable way to open itself full of understanding to external values, but it no longer loves itself. Of its history, it now sees only what is deplorable and destructive, while it is no longer able to perceive what is great and pure." And these are the words of Benedict XVI, and now I arrive at the last point of my presentation. We cannot deny that the decadent Europe today constitutes a land of conquest for peoples, social groups and individuals born outside and in opposition to it. The dictatorship of relativism suppresses Europe's Christian roots, dissolves its identity, and makes it a land of conquest for external aggressors. Today, Europe is threatened on its borders in Ukraine and in the Middle East, but the greatest threat it faces is within. Western civilization, European civilization, is going through a profound crisis which has remote cultural, psychological and moral origins, in a process that began with the hedonism of humanism and the Renaissance and has arrived at the relativism of our times. Professor Plinio Correa de Oliveira, in his book Revolution and Counter-Revolution, describes the stages, dynamism and the nature of this revolutionary process that assaulted Christian and Western civilization. In history, revolutions never come from below, but from above, from the abdication of elites, from corruption or from the weakness of those who lead peoples. The same happens with the collapse of civilization under the attack of external enemies. Those who win often prevail because of the enemy's weakness rather than their own strength. This is why Europe today finds itself in a situation similar to others it has experienced throughout its history. History, however, is not irreversible. In the 16th century, Europe, morally frayed by humanism, religiously torn apart by Protestantism, and attacked on land and sea by Islam, seemed lost. Yet it was precisely from Malta, even before Lepanto, that a signal of resistance and hope arose. You know this history better than me. In 1565, the Grand Master of the Order was Jean Parisot de la Valette, and at the end of March that he received the news that the Ottoman fleet, composed of 180 boats, including 103 galleys, had left the port of the Golden Horn at Constantinople and were headed towards the island of Malta. The Grand Master ordered the elderly women and children to embark for Sicily, and he recalled all the knights who at that moment were in Europe to return to Malta. The only ones who remained on Malta were those ready to fight to the bitter end. La Valette had only 700 knights at his disposal, but they were animated by an extraordinary fighting spirit. On May the 18th, 1565, the day on which the imposing Turkish fleet was first seen on the horizon, he gathered his knights and said to them, "We must defend our faith in order to prevent the Koran from supplanting the Gospels. God asks our life of us, which we have already owed to his service. Blessed are those who are the first to consume the sacrifice." The knights' resistance was so indomitable that when the Spanish galleys did finally arrive, the Turks, exhausted by the loss of over 30,000 men, had already decided to abandon the island. It was September the 12th, 1565. 250 knights of Malta had died in this siege, and almost all of them were incapacitated from their wounds, but Suleiman had been defeated. On the year after, the Grand Master laid the first stone of the new capital of Malta, today La Valette. Well, Europe is laden with history, but also with deep wounds. And today, weariness and discouragement are feelings often prevalent, not only among the older generations, but also among the young, unable to decipher their future. But this is not the first time this has happened, and in our faith we must find the supernatural strength to face the dark horizon before us. This supernatural spirit emerges also from the moving words with which St. Pius V wrote on December the 8th, 1570, to the Grand Master of Malta, Pietro de Monte, who succeeded Jean de la Valette as Grand Master of the Order, exhorting him not to abandon his post, because, he wrote, it would be against the divine will of the one who, by his special providence, has called you to this place, and who will help you to carry the burden that he has placed upon your shoulders. Pius then exhorted the Grand Master to not allow himself to become discouraged, neither because of your age nor because of your weakness, indeed to rouse yourself evermore to joyfully carry your cross and follow your Lord, who carried his cross for our sins. And the Pope continued thus: "You will know without a doubt that my cross is heavier than yours, that I am now lacking strength, and that there are many who try to make me succumb. I would certainly have failed and would have already renounced my dignity, which I have thought of doing more than once, if I did not trust, not in my own strength, but in the one who has said, 'Whoever wants to come after me, let him take up his cross and follow me.' Therefore, we cast our thoughts on Christ our Lord, and we conform our will to his, repeating not only with the mouth, but with the heart, 'Non mea, sed tua voluntas fiat.' This fighting spirit, which draws strength and example from the sacrifice on the cross, is antithetical to the relativism that envelops us. The words of St. Pius V are the words of a Pope who incites Christians to resist, to fight, and above all to hope in the help of divine providence by which everything is possible for man, even changing the course of history when all seems lost, because the king and the master of history is not man but God, who through his mysterious designs always leads Christians to victory. More than 20 years after his first appeal to Christian Europe, launched from Santiago de Compostela, John Paul II concludes his exhortation Ecclesia in Europe with this equally heartfelt peroration. Taking up anew this invitation to hope, I repeat to you again today, Europe, as you stand at the beginning of the third millennium, open the doors to Christ, be yourself, rediscover your origins, relive your roots. Down the centuries, you have received the treasure of Christian faith. It has grounded your life as society on principles drawn from the gospel, and the traces of this are evident in the art, literature, thought, and culture of your nations. But this heritage does not belong just to the past. It is a project in the making to be passed on to future generations, for it has indelibly marked the life of the individuals and peoples who together have forged the continent of Europe. These words are still relevant today. Christian roots are not a historical memory superimposed on other memories. They are a constitutive factor of European identity. Europe is either Christian or it is not. The alternative to Christian roots is the process of de-Christianization that has characterized Europe in recent centuries, and above all in the last years. So we have a duty to defend the West, to defend Europe, to defend the Christian roots of our civilization. The philosophy of the gospel, the perennial teaching of the church, the values of a Western and the Christian civilization will not pass away, because they are not ephemeral values, but are founded on the word of God, which knows no waning in the long course of centuries. We must therefore defend the Christian roots of Europe and the West, trusting in the help of God, who in the most difficult hours of history allows great victories, as happened at Malta and Lepanto. Of course, today there is no Constantine, there is no Christianity in arms, and there is no St. Pius V to guide us. But there is always God, even if the world ignores him. Everything passes, but God does not change, and we must trust in his intervention. God trusts in us. How could we lack trust in him?